I received one step removed, partly because of time zones, a debrief of Minister LeBlanc's discussions with his counterpart, Mr. Greer. They're constructive, substantive discussions. That's not surprising because beneath the surface, over the course of the last 12 months, there's been an exchange on a number of issues, so-called trade irritants, so more specific issues, as well as the big structural issues.
It's the Prime Minister in Japan, where he wrapped up a 10-day trade tour with stops in India, Australia, and Japan, obviously. How effective were the Prime Minister's trade missions? How important were those talks between Jameson Greer and Dominic LeBlanc on Friday? And what should we make of Pierre Poilievre's overseas trip? What does that signal for his leadership? Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum. Erin Wary, senior writer for CBC News here in Ottawa. Émilie Nicolas, a columnist for Le Devoir. She's in Montreal. And Rob Russo is a writer for The Economist, former CBC Parliamentary Bureau Chief, joining us from beautiful Calgary today. Good to see everyone. I'm going to start with the Prime Minister, and then we'll pivot to Mr. Poilievre and what he was up to. It was a big, long trip, Aaron, and there appeared to be a lot of deals that were begun or signed about energy, trade, critical minerals. How important is it that the Prime Minister keep these trips up, even as Dominic LeBlanc is trying to get things back on the rails with the United States?
Yeah, I don't think there's really much of an option at this point. I think it's a bit of a reminder that the job of Prime Minister at this point, and maybe going forward, is increasingly international. And you can't sort of treat foreign affairs and visits to other countries as sort of a secondary concern. Obviously, the thing that always gets said coming out of these trips is, it remains to be seen what the things that were signed amount to and sort of what comes next. But I think that's sort of a long-term play. And, obviously a lot of what happened this week was overshadowed by Iran, understandably and for good reason. But I think this is really, an indication that this is kind of the way things have to work from now on, that the Prime Minister has to spend a lot of time abroad, has to spend a lot of time in capitals, both shoring up trade relationships, but also, shoring up relationships with allies. I think it was the first time a Prime Minister had made a bilateral visit to Australia since 2014. I think that's the kind of thing that, we're probably not going to be able to go a decade without visiting Australia again. This is just the way the world works, and the way Canada has to act at this point.
And we will talk about Iran and the government's position on that in the next hour, just so people know. But there has been, I guess, some criticism, Émilie, from Conservatives that now Mark Carney is doing too much of this, that he's spending too much time trying to diversify trade and not enough time trying to make sure that things, get on track with the United States. I don't know. Dominic LeBlanc had this meeting, so obviously there are still conversations happening on that front.
Yes, and Pierre Poilievre is abroad himself, or was abroad himself. So I hear the concern. I think the concern is more, and I know we're going to get back to this later, but I think the concern is the executive style leadership of Mark Carney, where it seems like him and maybe one or two close advisors are just taking foreign policy positions from the depth of their brains, and then everybody else learns about it. And him being so far away from Parliament makes it even more of a interesting position for Canadian democracy, where Canadian media are not even privy to interviewing the Prime Minister himself while he's making really important speeches and policy conversations abroad. That being said, this week is also hard for him to politically score points because there's such a media eclipse around Iran. So really the upside of those trips is just the policy themselves and what do you achieve on those trips. And that is also hard for us to evaluate abroad because there are certainly certain announcements, but a lot of it is, prepping the relationship. And there's also a lot of variables that are in the air right now because of Iran and the spikes on energy prices and the uncertainty it's creating. It's making us having to recalibrate and recalculate and not just us, including India, Canada, and Japan. Everybody's trying to calculate what it's going to mean for their economy as well. As you're trying to negotiate deals, the variables are changing in real time. And so I think it makes it really hard for everybody to be, being able to list what the wins are. It doesn't mean that those trips are useless. It just means that as those of us back in the country feel a little bit like we're not in control at all of what's happening with our politics.
Rob, your perspective on the Prime Minister's trips?
I think there is always the most important audience when a Prime Minister goes abroad, and that's the audience at home. And that's traditionally been the case. I do think there's much to what Aaron was saying, though, that there is a compelling necessity for a Prime Minister to go abroad now. So it's not just about the audience at home. I thought Mr. Carney ran into the stark difference between realpolitik, which he espoused at Davos, and idealpolitik even before he left over controversy about whether or not India is still interfering in Canada, either in our domestic politics or in our diaspora here. I thought the trip to Japan, which didn't get a lot of attention here in Canada, was very, very important for the domestic audience. He did some things with Japan that is going to include Japan playing a role in the Arctic, which I think is very important, a very important signal to Russia and China. At the same time, what we didn't hear a lot about and we need to hear a lot about is Japan going to come to the rescue of Ontario's automobile industry? We have Donald Trump saying openly he wants cars that are produced in Canada to be produced in the United States. 3/4 of the cars that are produced in Canada are Japanese automobiles. We are going to need them not just to maintain that level of manufacturing, but accelerate it. The Chinese entry into the market is going to be slow and a trickle. We need Japan to step up. That's something that I think we should follow up on. But this notion of dividends being paid at home, that's changed. We need to go abroad. We need to seek not just political dividends, but economic dividends abroad as well.
Okay, let's do a quick round, if we can, on Mr. Poilievre's trips to the UK and to Germany, giving speeches, meeting with various politicians, to try and build, I think, his credibility as a potential leader in a situation where, as you've all pointed out, there's a lot going on in the world and it's hard to get attention. Was this a good idea, a necessary trip that he had to do, Aaron?
Yeah, I think it fits with what we were just talking about in terms of the job of the Prime Minister being more international. I think it also fits within what you've seen from Pierre Poilievre in terms of kind of tweaking his own presentation, his own sort of public image. I don't know how on the latter, how much that will stick. He still gave an interview when he was in England in which he, talked disparagingly about the idea of net zero. And we're not that far removed from him making some rather controversial comments about the RCMP. So I think the question really is sort of how long this, I don't know if you want to call it a makeover or a slight change in his image is going to stick.
Emily?
I think it's from the British audience or the Germany audience. The question is, what's in this for us to meet with this guy? Because he's not in charge. He's not making this decision. What's interesting that the conversation in Germany was in part about LNG and building pipelines. I don't know. I put myself in a German person's shoe, and I just wonder what the authority of the person is. And so it's a little bit the same tricky situation that Jamil Jivani's in. It's not about their personal quality. It's just that people are looking to meet with Canadian officials who have an authority to move business forward. And because Pierre Poilievre has been so oppositional, it's not clear what's in it for them. So it sounds like it is, here's what I would look like if I was in a more of a good position, but it's not clear what it actually is achieving.
Last word to you, Rob.
Mark Carney launched himself into a higher popular orbit at Davos. Pierre Poilievre needed to respond. He needed to respond by looking statesmanlike. That's what I was talking about when I talked about dividends at home from work abroad. As a purely political play, he needed to do it. I thought his most important speech, though, was in Toronto in suggesting an alternative path in dealing with Donald Trump in the United States, being that it's not a permanent rupture, but he needed to do it. I thought he did undermine it a little bit with his appearance on the podcast, talking about a green grift and the ultra-liberal New York Times. But I thought the Toronto speech was an important beginning and an effective one for him as well.
We will stand by our allies when it makes sense. There's a distinction between the offensive actions that were taken and are being taken by the United States and Israel, that were taken by them without consultation with Canada, with other allies, and we're not party to those actions. But we will always defend Canadians. We will always stand by and defend our allies when called upon.
The Prime Minister facing criticism over his comments on the U.S. and Israeli attack on the Iranian regime. Mark Carney initially expressed support for U.S. actions against Iran, later said he made those comments with some regret and called for international laws to be followed. The Conservatives accuse him of flip-flopping. So where does the government stand now? Let's bring back our Sunday Scrum. Erin Wherry, a senior writer for CBC News here in Ottawa. Emily Nicolas, a columnist for Le Devoir. She's in Montreal. Rob Rousseau, a writer for The Economist, former CBC Parliamentary Bureau Chief. I guess we're just going to say that till the end of time, apparently. Joining us from Calgary today.
There's a statute of limitations.
There must be at some point. But anyway, I'll start with you, Rob. What did you make of the Prime Minister's handling of this? In this initial written statement saying that they supported the U.S. trying to get rid of nuclear capabilities in Iran, and then spending really days trying to make sure that people understood where he really stood on the issue.
I think it reflects the reality of where we are in Canada today, that economic typhoons are unleashed in Canada because of the twitch muscles of Donald Trump. So when a statement like that is crafted, it's crafted really, it was in this instance, for an audience of one, and that was Donald Trump. And we've seen that in the recent past. I was with the Prime Minister on his last trip abroad when this whole notion of the Board of Peace came up. And Mr. Carney, the Prime Minister, initially said that, yes, he would take part in the Board of Peace. And then he actually had a little chance to look at it, gauge the reaction to it, and had to withdraw as elegantly as he could. And it wasn't easy to do that with very much dignity. That statement that you read, that initial statement, said that Canada supported the U.S. in its objective of trying to make Iran a non-nuclear state. Yeah. Well, when you say you support the U.S. these days, what you're saying is you're putting your trust in Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth. And that's a difficult place to be, particularly when you don't have an audience of one. You've got a Liberal caucus, you've got a domestic audience that does not want to be associated with Donald Trump. And I think what followed after that statement was a result of people putting that calculation into the machine.
Yeah, it was curious, Emily, that the initial statement didn't talk about international law and rules in any way, given what the Prime Minister said in Davos. I mean, he got there, and I'm not saying that wasn't important, but there was really a lack of nuance in that initial statement.
I think it was a grave mistake for the Prime Minister to not use Rob's words, to not put that calculation into the machine right away. Yeah. There's been an American invasion of Iran threatened for months. Certainly the last time was in January. Certainly it should have been in the scenario so far. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not just a calculation of not hiring Donald Trump, although it is part of it. I think because we've seen it from part of the media commentary within the country who are not speaking to Donald Trump. Part of it is just justified hatred for the Iranian regime in a way that has blinded some folks to the importance of international law. Yeah. There is that impulse sometimes to cheer on the bad guy taking a hit that is really not within our best interest mid and long term. That has been, I think, the mistake of the Iraq war in so many ways. And it has been the mistake just in January of people who thought that somehow the abdication of and capture of Nicolas Maduro would lead to some sort of freedom or liberation for the Venezuelan people. It's very clear to me that the American interest was weakened Venezuela and not a freed Venezuelan people. And I think with Donald Trump's speech on Monday, it needs to be very clear as well to everyone that what the Americans and the Israeli want is a weakened Iran and not a free Iranian people. There was not a single mention in there of women's rights, of human rights, of civil liberty. That is not what the Americans are after. And I think everybody in Canada who believes that's what the Americans are up to or what the Israelis are up to need to sober up really fast. And that includes the Prime Minister of this country.
Yeah, I mean, both the president and Israel have called for the people to rise up and take back their country. But I take all your points, Emily. I would also say too, Aaron, and I know you've written about this. I think Emily's point is a really stark one, that because the Iranian regime is so hated, perhaps this is less damaging politically for the prime minister because everyone agrees it's a terrible oppressor of its people. But give me your perspective on where we are a few days after all of this now.
Yeah, I don't know how much of a lasting sort of wound this leaves for the prime minister, but I do think, to Emily's point, the Venezuela comparison is apt. If you go back and look at the Canadian statement on that, when Nicolas Maduro was captured by the United States, the Canadian government had, nothing good to say about the Maduro regime, but it didn't take a stance on what the United States had done. And in this case, for whatever reason, maybe to Rob's point, the idea was to sort of put something in there that Donald Trump would notice. But for whatever reason, they made this comment about supporting American action. And to Rob's other point, I think you have to be cognizant of the fact that the United States hadn't explained why it was doing this. The federal government has acknowledged that it wasn't consulted. And you've now seen, perhaps predictably, a war with multiple and in some cases contradictory objectives stated by the American government. And so I think, I don't know that it leaves lasting damage, but perhaps there's a lasting lesson here about, expressing support for American action carried out by this president.
Well, especially because you don't know where it's going to go, the point you've all made, right? And certainly history would at least teach you that as a leader of another country, to just maybe, hold your water until you see how things are unfolding. I don't know, Rob, is this just the case of a prime minister who understands the world very well, but maybe in this case just didn't understand the politics of it?
I guess the answer is yes to every question you just asked. I think that there are times when he looks really polished, even in the House of Commons, where he's reminding us all that he's a rookie. And he doesn't look like a rookie, but he looked like a rookie this past week. There are compelling reasons why we would want this regime gone if we are Canadians. Nobody cares. Nobody's waiting to hear about Canada's position on the war. The reality is we have no role to play in that part of the world, very little role to play. And we haven't had an embassy in Tehran for, I think, 13, 14 years now. However, there are compelling Canadian interests there. Iran killed 55 of our citizens on a Ukrainian airliner in 2020. Iran savagely tortured Zara Kazemi, a Montrealer, about a dozen or so years ago. Agents of Iran work in Canada. Just a few days ago, a judo shop in Toronto, just north of Toronto, was shot up. So there are ways that we can make it clear that we have nothing but distaste for the Iranian regime without supporting Donald Trump's war.
Aaron Wherry, Rob Russo, thank you both so much. Emily Nicolas, happy International Women's Day to you, friend. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
And to both of you.
Thank you. Thanks, fellas.